The English language is a fascinating mix of so many different languages, including the original Brythonic, Germanic, Norse. You've got elements of French, Norman French in particular, Latin, of course, and then more modern introductions from the Indian subcontinent, and more. And it's full of unexpected history. Hana Videen is an academic and collector of Old English words, and she's here today to discuss how the words people in the Middle Ages used can tell us about the way they thought. Welcome to Future Imperfect. Welcome everybody to another episode of Future Imperfect. It's me, Jason Kingsley. I have a wonderful guest today who I'm very excited to talk to. Hana, welcome to the podcast. Would you do the honours and please introduce yourself and explain what it is we're going to be talking about today in general?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me. My name is Hana Videen. I did a PhD in English literature, and my focus was on Old English literature. During the PhD, I started building my own word hoard, which was something I did on Twitter, but eventually it moved on to Facebook, Instagram, a blog. And my Old English word hoard was me sharing an Old English word every day. So I've been doing this for, 11 years now, going through different words every day. And while I was doing this, I got interested in the idea of writing a book that included my favorite words that I've come across that I've found really interesting or funny or strange. And that became the book, The Word Hoard, Daily Life in Old English. And more recently, I wrote a book called The Dayer Hoard, an Old English bestiary. And that arose from my interest specifically in animals, in mythology and history, and I wanted to look at the words and stories about animals specifically in Old English.
Oh, that's wonderful. So a word hoard, is it how it sounds? Is that like a collection of wonderful words?
Yeah, word hoard is an interesting word. It's my favorite word in Old English. It sounds like it refers to a dictionary or a thesaurus, but it's really a more metaphorical thing. It's a poet's personal sort of mental collection of words and phrases to pull out when they're telling a story. So back in early medieval times, a lot of stories would have been told orally, and it's handy to have certain words and phrases at hand or in your mind, in your word hoard, to draw upon when you're telling a story. So that's what the idea of the word hoard is. And the word appears 7 times in Old English literature, often alongside the word to unlock. So there's this idea of unlocking a word hoard. And that's what I wanted to do with my sharing of Old English language, is to sort of open this not as much studied, area of history to lots of people to draw their own favorites from.
I mean, this is fascinatingly poetic, isn't it? Even an unfamiliar term like a word hoard, for me, immediately triggers sort of poetic images of dusty libraries in your mind and like a treasury, like a basement filled with beautiful words. Is that a feature of Old English as a language? I mean, this is a period in history post-Roman and what arguably used to be called the Dark Ages. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that phrase, the Dark Ages, is quite out of fashion at the moment in history. But is that something you can tell us a little bit more about, and the setting for the concept of a word hoard?
Sure. Well, yeah, the Dark Ages is a phrase I don't like. It's basically people in the Renaissance trying to feel superior to people of the more recent past, and like looking back to classical writers and artists as being the pinnacle of wisdom and artistry. But yeah, the Dark Ages is sometimes referred to in that way because we know perhaps less about it than in other times of history. There's perhaps less of a written record there, but still there's much to be learned from what does survive.
So I was thinking, we're sort of familiar with sort of Roman Empire, and then the collapse of the Roman Empire, or rather the withdrawal of the legions from the islands of Britain, is fairly, not well documented, but it happened fairly abruptly. And then I think there's some debate over what actually happened to the people left behind. And I think that's fairly lively debate amongst historians. And personally, as somebody who loves genre fiction, it conjures up an almost post-apocalyptic, but a historical post-apocalyptic setting.
Hmm.
Then fast forward a few generations to 600, 700, 800. Is that sort of roughly the period you're talking about?
Well, it's tricky because the Old English period is technically from around 550 to 1150. It's basically from when a lot of immigrants are coming over from Northern Europe and settling there. So there's like a big influx of new people and new languages are coming in. And then it sort of starts being transformed into what is known as Middle English after the Norman conquest, and also during a time when there's much less writing in vernacular literature. So there's a bit of a transition phase.
Is that when French starts to get overlaid?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly would have been plenty of contact with people from Normandy before the Norman conquest through travel and trade, but English doesn't really become as steeped in French and Latin as it does after that period. There's some Latin influence, but not very much. And so when I'm talking about the period, technically it's this whole like 500-year range of time. But most of the literature that survives from that time is actually from around the 9th and 10th century. So really, that's the period that we have the most information about. The earlier part of the period, there's very little remaining of like the written in terms of written records of what was going on.
And do you think words and the way they were used was important to society at that time? Does that come out from the literature?
Certainly, the survival of poetry shows that there's this fascination with words and how they can be used. The way the written word becomes very, very important after the introduction of Christianity and the Roman and Latin alphabet, recording words. Yeah, I think the fact that the word has remained word, WORD, for thousands of years, it says something about the importance of that idea and concept that it hasn't changed for so long. Yeah.
Do you think there's this concept of sort of poetic use of words? Because I was looking at the book and there's a sort of compound words you talk about, and they're very poetic. They sort of describe aspects of something in a beautiful way. And I think this goes later. I think the Northern Europeans typically, that Tolkien studied obviously a lot, use complex imagery to describe things rather than just giving it a title
Right.
and using that. They sort of describe it in the word. Is that familiar to you?
Yes, it's one of my favorite aspects of Old English. It's called a kenning. And a kenning is a kind of metaphor that takes two nouns that on their own mean something different. Putting them together, it creates a different meaning. So one of them, for instance, you might call the ocean the swan rod, which means the swan's road. So it's where swans go. It's where they travel.
Yeah.
You have other really marvelous ones that are kind of riddles in a way, like Gangawavra means walking weaver, which is a type of animal that's featured in the Dare Hoard. It is the spider. So it's something that weaves as it walks. So yeah, you get these amazing kennings to describe different things. And they do only really appear in poetry, but it's a tradition that comes from Northern Europe as well. You find it in Old Norse poetry and sagas as well.
Do you think they did speak like that, though, or is this a literary convention? Is this sort of the written word, and is it placed sort of, well, we probably don't know this, but do you think it's placed knowingly in the written word, so people are writing with a view to it being clever, or is it illustrating the way they spoke, perhaps?
It's definitely sort of an artistic impetus, like to use words like this. Nowadays, if you're told to write a poem, you often think, oh, it needs to rhyme. You know, that's what a poem is. But rhyme wasn't important in the Old English period. What was important was alliteration. So having words starting with the same sound. And kennings were a great way around that. So if you wanted a word for a spider, for instance, one more common word for a spider was adderkop, but you wanted to have a G sound, then you could use a word like gangawavra, and that might fit better into the rest of your line of poetry that you're composing. So that's one reason for these compounds, is just to maintain the sort of the stress and the alliteration of the poetry. There's also an interest in riddles in Old English. There's over 100 riddles that have been recorded in Old English. And I think that plays to the same sort of intellectual curiosity of sort of looking at different ways to describe things. from the way you normally would from sort of a more literal description.
Were these works read out and sort of performed, do you think? Was there sort of an amount of spoken poetry or things sort of spoken around the campfire, for want of an expression? Is that part of it? The sort of the telling of the tale is the performance.
Yeah, it's far more likely that people would have heard a story told or heard a sermon or heard a poem spoken aloud than to have read it themselves, partly because not everyone could read and access to written works would have been fairly limited as well. So even if you're thinking about someone who lived in a monastery that had its own scriptorium and its own collection of books, perhaps all of the books were written out by hand, and it's a very expensive and time-consuming task to create a book. So it's not like you'd have multiple copies of a book that everyone could be reading at once. You'd perhaps have one monk or nun reading aloud from a book to a group of people, and that would be how they would appreciate the literature. So the idea of silent reading is far less common. Like today, when we think of reading, we often think about just sitting by ourselves with a book, but it was a much more social, oral activity back then. And not always necessarily from a book. Sometimes, as I was saying before, with the poetry reciting sort of from memory or composing on the spot.
So maybe in some ways, what we've got is the written record of things that were primarily spoken. These are sort of like notes almost of the big part of their culture. These things spoken, hence alliteration was important. And presumably the rhythm of the lines is important as well.
Yes. The general pattern is sort of having 2 or 3 stressed syllables in the first half line and then 1 or 2 in the second half. So you have certain syllables have more stress than others. And so it's not as sort of regular as something like iambic pentameter, where you have this da-da, da-da, da-da that Shakespeare uses. But when you have a line of poetry, like the first line of Beowulf, it would sound something like Huatwe Gardena and Yer Dagum. And you have these certain syllables of the line that have emphasis. So that's sort of how it worked. And generally the syllables with the emphasis were the ones that alliterated.
So in some ways, these were probably experienced by ordinary people as told tales, perhaps brought together, looking forward to this particular person's rendition of a story you already know and have heard dozens of times, and sort of falling into the spoken word and the spoken in the noises of the fire or people murmuring to each other. Do you think people joined in at all with these recitations? Do you think that's a possibility?
It's a possibility. I don't know. I hadn't really thought about that. I haven't come across any scholarship that is looking into that specifically.
Because Shakespeare, which is obviously much, much later, but Shakespeare was much more earthy than we might think, I believe. There were people that went to watch a bit of a Shakespeare play. And left, this is the really good piece, so let's go and watch that bit. And interaction with the audience, much like comedians might do today in stand-up, there's sort of a certain level of interaction there. And I wonder whether the word hoard and, the deer hoard is actually a fragment of a sort of social experience, that the way people that would have experienced these words as spoken rhythmically and understood. I find that quite evocative. Kind of conjures up, dark nights around a fire.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you do have some words like the very first word of Beowulf is Huat, and there's arguments about what that means exactly. It changes into our word what, W-H-A-T, but the sort of argument for what it is at the beginning of Beowulf is something to get people's attention. So it's like saying so or listen or whatever.
Yeah, pay attention.
Yeah, because you imagine you're trying to get your rowdy audience to stop talking and actually pay attention to your poem, which is another indication that it was an oral sort of shared social experience rather than silent reading.
Yeah. So coming back to your recent book, the book about animals and stuff, and you talked about spiders being called weaver walkers. Are there any other sort of turns of phrase that you particularly think are wonderful, that you really enjoy?
Yeah, I don't really talk about them in the book, but Hrathemus is an animal, the name of which I really love. It literally means adorned mouse, and it's what they call bats. So it's a lovely description of a mouse adorned with wings, which I just think is a lovely description. So,
That is lovely. Yes, I think that's wonderful.
yeah,
Anything else? Anything related to horses? I've got horses in my life,
yeah,
and the horses were very, associated with the Celtic peoples as well, and obviously throughout history. But
yeah.
was there anything to do with horses?
Well, I'm trying to think if there's a word that's for a horse, but I can think of horse words sort of cropping up in other descriptions of things.
Right.
For instance, a samer is a seahorse, but what it is referring to is a ship. So it's a horse you use on the sea.
So they use the horse as a base metaphor, which then overlaid onto the sea, and then that becomes a ship. So
Yeah, yeah.
that probably shows that horses were kind of key component, because you can't use a metaphor unless everybody understands it.
Yeah, exactly. And you get horse also, like if you're trying to describe a strange creature that is sort of bits and bobs of other animals, you might use horse, like, oh, it has a head like a horse or something like that.
Right.
And you know that you wouldn't use that comparison unless everyone knows what a horse looks like. You wouldn't say, oh, has limbs like a tardigrade or something to
Yeah.
someone today. Like, well, what does that look like? Or you're choosing an animal that's familiar to many people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talk in the book about the Anglo-Saxons discussing treating spider bites.
Yeah.
And I think that's worth investigating, because there aren't really poisonous spiders, bad ones. I wasn't sure. So what's that all about?
Well, actually, could I just pause for a moment to talk about the term Anglo-Saxon?
Oh, yes, sure.
Because I don't use that term in my book on purpose.
Okay.
It's a term that I actually used until a few years ago, I guess, when I was starting to write the word horde. I used the term Anglo-Saxon in my PhD dissertation because that was generally how we talked about this period of history. But more recently, scholars have been pointing out that that isn't a very accurate term to describe this group of people that weren't just Angles, they weren't just Saxons, they included people from a variety of different places, and they probably wouldn't have identified themselves as Anglo-Saxons. You get a few references from rulers who are trying to express that they have power over all these people, then they use a term like that, but individually they probably just refer to themselves as English, which is a difficult term for us to use because it means something else to us today. But usually when people talk about this period now, they refer to early medieval England or the English or early medieval English. Or if you want to be more specific, because you maybe have archaeological evidence that we're talking about people from a certain place, you could say the Saxons or the Angles or the Northumbrians or the Jutes or whatever group of people you're referring to. But scholars have brought up that Anglo-Saxons generally used as an ethno-racial identifier that's come up sort of in the eras of colonization. People think of it as being a more recent sort of alt-right kind of thing, but it actually goes back to the 18th, 17th centuries. Sort of this idea of trying to see the history of this island being a unified, white, homogenous people, which is not the case. So that's why it's not used as much now.
I mean, that's also interesting from a historical perspective because, of course, the way we use words changes. And so for you interpreting words from the past, you can't help but interpret them through the lens of your own personal experience and the way you speak as well. How do you go about? So when you're putting together the analysis of looking at how animals, for example, are used, how do you try and sort of get around the sort of biases that we all have as modern people? And how do you get into the mind of people in the early medieval period?
Well, really just seeing what the literature says about a thing and sort of taking it at face value, I guess. I mean, one of the things that a couple scholars have talked about is in medieval bestiaries, there's images of owls, and you might see a picture of an owl just surrounded by a group of birds. And to us, nowadays, we generally think of owls as being associated with wisdom because of the connection to the goddess Athena and the idea of the wise old owl. But in the Middle Ages, it was actually the owl's lack of day vision was seen as reflective of a Jewish person's sort of blindness to the light that is God. And so the owl's actually used as an anti-Semitic symbol. And the birds that are surrounding the owl are actually attacking it, like pecking at it. And that's sort of a promotion of anti-Semitic violence that we would not read at all upon seeing an image of an owl in a medieval text. So it gets quite complicated because some of the images do survive over time. We see a lion and we think of the lion as the king of beasts, maybe, and that's a concept that we have today. And that does transfer over, but then you might get something like the owl, which has become quite different. So
that's really interesting.
Yeah, and texts describe these things, but just looking at a visual without the context of the writing, then you wouldn't necessarily get that idea.
Well, there's one that in my area of study, the sort of high medieval and late medieval in particular, and when you look at marginalia and manuscripts and things, and you see people drawing snails, and you see what many people think of as rabbits, but to me, they're clearly hares.
Mm-hmm.
And there are sort of hares riding snails and jousting. And I'm thinking, that's such a complex image. What are they saying? Are they about knights in armor being stupid like hares, or fast, or elusive, or good to eat? And why are they riding snails? We have to just guess, and we may be wrong. I had a question for you, which is, obviously, the further back in history we go, the more is missing. Is there any work that refers to things that we don't have a record of? So we know it existed, but we don't know what was said.
Yeah, we do have lists from libraries that would be like a monastic library would have a list of all of the works that were included there. And so we get things like there is a Liber Bestiarum that appears in early medieval England, but just the title of this Latin bestiary, which hasn't survived from that time. So we know that things like that exist. We also know from even in sort of our more recent history, there have been manuscripts destroyed by fire, like the Ashburnham House fire in the 18th century was a lot of the texts that we have from this period didn't survive.
So they were lost more recently. So we know we had them, but...
Yeah. We even have transcriptions that people wrote sort of more recently in the 17th century or 18th century or something. They've sort of copied down the text, but we don't have the original text. We only have what they wrote down. So we also don't know how accurate it was. We don't have the context of the manuscript because it was lost. Like Beowulf itself was almost lost in the fire. The pages are singed, and it's the only copy we have of the poem. So parts of it are damaged too much to even read.
Oh, just one copy of Beowulf survived.
Yeah. So it makes you wonder, well, how many other poems were in existence that we just don't have anymore?
And presumably what we've got are the random remains, if you like, of history. And so these may not even be the best or most creative works.
Yeah.
They may have been okay, you know?
Yeah. Mary Wellesley, the medievalist Mary Wellesley, recently wrote a book that talks about the Ashburnham House fire. And she talks about how certain books were sort of prioritized over others when they were being thrown out windows while they were trying to put out the fire. And generally, it was the texts from the later medieval period that were prioritized over the early ones. For whatever reason, the librarians and people who were saving the books thought these are the ones that are most important for us to keep. So consequently, there's far fewer texts from this time period, not only because it was long ago, but because they weren't seen as being as valuable.
Well, selection bias, isn't it? I know, because I used to be a trustee of the Royal Armouries, and I know that there's a priority list of things to grab in the event of a fire today. And that exists, I presume, in all museums and all libraries. There's probably a list of, quick, get those, they're really important. And I imagine things like Magna Carta is on there, as number one, and are things that we may not consider to be particularly valuable now, which may become more valuable in a different context. Could well have been lost. That's really interesting. I was going to ask about mythological animals, because we've talked about real animals, talked about spiders and horses, and in what context and what kind of creatures do you talk about in the Deer Horde that are mythological?
I guess the term mythological is also something that, I mean, it's a term that we use, but the animals wouldn't have been mythological back in this time period. They were written in the same context as what we would consider real animals. So they appear in poetry, they appear in homilies and saints' lives, they appear in travel logs. So Alexander the Great, there's a letter of his to his tutor that was Originally written in Greek, but it was translated into many languages because he was a real popular character throughout history. And we get his descriptions of weird animals that he saw and sort of marvelous animals that were far away. And we get things that are more familiar, like the griffin or a dragon or things that we would recognize today. Then we get descriptions of really strange animals that have not survived the test of time so much, like chickens that burst into flame when you try to capture them, or something called the teeth tyrant, which we're not really sure what it is.
The teeth tyrant.
The teeth tyrant. It's the only creature in my book that doesn't have an Old English name. It appears in an Old English text, but they only refer to it using the Latin term, so dentis tyrannum. It's very strange because you'd think that with a name like that, the most important aspect of the animal would be its teeth, but the text doesn't actually mention the teeth at all. It just talks about how it has 3 big horns and it kind of resembles a big black horse, and it's very fierce, and you have to kill it with spears and hammers.
Yep.
People try to attack it. It isn't afraid of fire. I mean, all these strange descriptions that you don't know, is that a real animal? Is it an exaggeration of something that he came across? Who knows?
A complete mystery beast that has a brilliant name, Teeth Tyrant.
Yeah.
But it also seems, from what you've said, it seems to be described as if it was real.
Yeah.
Giving you techniques how to hunt it and what its weaknesses are and what its weaknesses aren't, sort of lends you to think they genuinely thought it was real and you might come across it. Otherwise, why bother saying how to kill it?
Yeah.
So they're presumably aware of lions and things like that. Not tigers, I would guess, because too far away. Elephants? Did elephants feature?
You say because they're too far away, but there was actually more travel during that time than one might expect. Like, people were traveling as far as Africa and the Middle East during this time period. Certainly not everyone, but there was movement between, certainly in the Christian world, like there was a lot of crossover to learn from different monasteries and courts. So there would be that, there would be pilgrimage. So it's not impossible that someone would have seen these animals. But yeah, a lot of the way you would learn about it is from reading books about it. So seeing people's illustrations in texts and reading about them and sort of having the same stories passed on again and again. There's much more of a reliance on, like, if it's been written down before by a good authority, that's more trustworthy in a way than just being able to say, oh, I saw one for myself. But you can't really believe that person as much as you can if, say, Herodotus wrote about it and, Pliny wrote about it and it's been recorded many times.
Yeah, there's that whole thing, isn't there, about the authenticity of the ancients, and somehow they're more authentic because they're ancient and wise, and they're wiser than we are today, and therefore they got it all right.
Yeah.
And it's only recently where we started to go, yeah, probably not.
Yeah.
And probably making it up just as much or as little as anybody else. I'm always fascinated by creatures like unicorns, though, because of the component of the horn, the narwhal horn, which sort of acts as physical proof they exist without seeing the whole beast.
Yeah.
Is a unicorn a thing in the early medieval period, as far as you're aware?
The unicorn actually doesn't really crop up in any of the Old English texts that I'm aware of. The Latin text may be different, but not in Old English. There's not a word for unicorn. But yeah, we get other creatures that they sound like they could be real creatures. They just don't have a name that we recognize or any obvious sort of body parts that we'd recognize as well. Like the Nicor, a creature that appears in multiple Old English texts, both Beowulf and appears in Alexander the Great's adventures, like him talking about things that he's seen. And all we really know about it is that it was a scary creature that lived in the water, and it's very dangerous.
Right.
And that is really about it. There's no physical descriptions.
So do we have a clue what it might have been in modern terms, or is it purely fictional, or is it a version of a real creature? Do we not even know?
Yeah, I mean, there's theories that it's something like a hippopotamus or it's an alligator or something like that. But then you wonder, well, why were you finding those in medieval Scandinavia? That doesn't seem too likely. And you also get creatures that are sort of, the names are clearly connected. So you get like the Necker or the knucker. There's places called knucker holes in Cornwall, I believe, where it's like, there's certainly a connection in the word, but we don't know if they were perceived as different things.
I was going to ask about, are there other types? He's talking about goblins or little people or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is the sort of other types of human sentient creature mentioned?
Yeah, I didn't talk about them really in the Deohord as much since my focus was on animals, although the final chapter, the epilogue, I do talk a bit about this crossover between human and animal. But in terms of mythical human creatures, there's lots of elves. The word elf in Old English, and there are references to elves in leech books, which are medical texts, and you're not sure if these diseases were actually believed to be caused by elves or if that was some sort of a metaphorical way of referring to a disease that you don't really know the cause of. Like, it's just strange pain. You don't know why you're having it. Maybe it was caused by elves.
Right. I think the modern medical way of describing that is idiopathic.
Yeah, exactly.
And by elves, a lot of our modern audience will probably think of Tolkien's elves, that sort of big, tall, sort of fair humans.
Mm-hmm.
But is an elf from this period like that, or is it more goblin-like little creatures?
I mean, there's not really any descriptions of them, but they do seem more, I don't know, from what I've read, I imagine something smaller and, I don't know,
Okay.
more fairy-like in a way, like something that's not like a full-sized human, I would imagine, from the descriptions.
Right, so diminutive,
Yeah.
hidden away secret powers, interacting in interesting ways.
Yeah.
So two areas I want to talk about just to finish off. So what about hybrid human-animal combinations? So we've got centaurs and things like that from ancient Greece. Is there sort of a concept of that in your Deer Horde, the sort of hybrid human-animal?
Yeah, definitely. The one that I talk about the most comes at the very end of the book where I'm talking about Halfhunding, which means half hound. So it's a person that's half dog and half human. Basically, it's a human with a dog head.
Right.
And the most famous of the Halfhundingers is actually Saint Christopher.
St. Christopher was a dog-headed.
Yes.
Wow.
It's not something I knew at first either. You'd think of Saint Christopher, you generally think of, big strong man carrying the baby Jesus across a river. That's your image of Christopher. But back in this period, the most well-known image of Christopher was a dog-headed man. And you get stories about him being able to pray, even though he didn't have the power of speech. He was still able to sort of pray to God, and then was able to become Christian despite his dog-headedness. But the dog head never goes away. Even when he has the power to speak, he still has a dog head. So that still is an essential part of him.
Wow. When does that change? Is there a sort of a moment in history where that seems to have sort of been rewritten? Did the Catholic Church go, hang on, we can't have a dog-headed priest?
I'm not sure exactly. I think that it did survive longer, that imagery survives longer in the Eastern Christian church, longer than in the Western. But I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly when that sort of crossover went.
I'm going to have to look that up because that's fascinating, because it almost sounds a bit like a werewolf.
Yeah.
In a way. And he's sort of talking about a saint being a werewolf, and that has put some sort of really odd images in my head about the early Christian pantheon. That's wonderful. Lastly, dragons. So tell me about how dragons were seen and how they might have been described and their sort of place in this pantheon of creatures.
Yeah, sure. So I find in Old English there's more of a gray area, the division between serpent and worm and dragon, like even talking about Satan sometimes. It's not sure. Like the term worm, which is spelled W-Y-R-M, can be used to refer to your general garden variety earthworm as well as to the dragon that Beowulf defeated.
So you'd have to know the context, otherwise it wouldn't look very impressive.
It's quite a lot of range.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting in a way. And the fact that serpents and dragons, in some of the stories that are illustrated, you see something that looks more like a serpent. Other times you see something that's more dragon-like. But a word that just means dragon, like sort of without any confusion is draka, which is a lot less common than the word worm, but it is used to refer to a dragon specifically, and it comes from Latin. And I guess one of the most interesting things I learned about dragons when I was working on this book was that fire-breathing dragons may have appeared for the first time in early medieval England in the poem Beowulf. There were dragons before then, obviously, for thousands of years, going to different parts of the world, but they were not fire-breathers. And possibly the reason for this was in the early medieval period, there was a popular image of the gates to hell being a beast's mouth, specifically a dragon's mouth, and the hellfire that's associated with the gates to hell would have maybe passed over into these stories about dragons, the beasts, and then producing fire.
That's wonderful. I love that. I love the idea of people misunderstanding that Beowulf was fighting a worm, an earthworm.
Yeah.
It kind of completely undermines his heroic deeds.
Does.
And they go, no, I meant a worm as in the big one that's really scary. Oh, okay, cool. We get it. We get the context now.
Yeah.
Are there any other things in the book that you particularly want to mention to our listeners? Because it's got so much in it, and I feel like we've only skimmed the surface.
I guess one of the things that I find really interesting is there are creatures that are good and bad that have very similar characteristics. So generally, the good guys in bestiaries are the animals that represent Christ in some way, and the ones that are baddies represent the devil in some way. And not all creatures fall into those two categories, but some of them very much do. And one example of that is the panther is seen as representative of Christ, whereas the whale is representative of Satan. And these are not necessarily creatures that we would think, oh yeah, panther's definitely Christ, whale definitely the Lord of Darkness. It's not really an association we have. And what I find interesting is that the characteristics that these two creatures have that are talked about are sometimes the same, but they're used for different purposes. So both the panther and the whale have breath that is fragrant. It has beautiful fragrance, which again, it's a whale, so we'll ignore the problem of breath in whales, but like they both have this fragrance that attracts other animals to it. But in the case of the panther, it's sort of attracting followers and bringing people to the faith. And in the case of the whale, it's attracting people to the gates of hell and being carried down to their doom at the bottom of the ocean. So I guess that's one thing that I found quite interesting in translating these texts.
Wow, that's quite complex and layered, isn't it, as well? So when you're coming to interpret the stories, you've got to be aware that the same, fragrant breath can be used both in a good and a bad way, again, depending on context. So context is a very important component of understanding what people were reading, isn't it? That's fascinating. Well, look, thank you so much. We're right out of time.
Sure.
Could have spoken for longer. I had a few more questions. So thank you very much. If people want to follow your work, you've got the Word Hoard and the Deer Hoard, which are available in bookshops and all online.
Wherever books are sold, yep.
Fantastic. And do you have social media? Do people follow you on social media in any way?
Yes. So the Word Hoard started out as being a Twitter thing. Now it's X or whatever, but it's OE Word Hoard. You can follow me there. Also, if you search for Old English Word Hoard on Facebook and Instagram, I'm there. I have a blog that's Old English Word Hoard, WORDHORD.com, where you can subscribe for Word of the Day. And also, if you have an iOS device, you can download the free app, which will tell you the Old English word of the day as well. So there are many ways to get your Old English fix.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time. I've really enjoyed it. And we even had a little bit of an intervention in the middle of it from lightning and thunder, I think. So somebody's either looking down favourably or not. I'm not quite sure how to interpret those signs. But thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks.